The strangest part about the night my parents disowned me at a dinner table in Scottsdale, Arizona, is that I had already read the ending. Literally. Page 11, Clause 4, notarized and filed with the county recorder's office 7 months prior. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit of mine. Seeing the last page before I've even cracked the spine. Occupational hazard when you're an estate attorney who has spent the better part of 15 years writing other people's endings for them. You start to develop a sixth sense for how things conclude. Rarely cleanly. Rarely fairly. Almost always with someone in a folding chair at a law office, looking at a document and realizing that the person they loved either didn't love them back quite as much, or loved them in the particular way that expresses itself in sub-clauses and conditional trusts. I know. Very cheerful profession. My name is Miriam. I'm 41 years old. I drive a sensible gray Toyota. I eat lunch at my desk 3 days out of 5. I have a cat named Footnote, who knocks things off counters with surgical precision, and I have spent the majority of my adult life being what my family calls the difficult one, which in my family's particular dialect means the one who asks questions. Here is the question I had been asking quietly for years. What happens when the family that shaped you finally puts it in writing? I found out on a Tuesday in March when my mother called to say she was making her famous lamb chops, and would I please come to dinner? And yes, my brother Derek would be there with Candace. And no, it wasn't a big deal, just family. It was, as it turned out, a very big deal. To understand the dinner, you have to understand Scottsdale. Not the Scottsdale of magazines, not the resort pools and the pink sunsets and the golf carts gliding through manicured streets, like something from a retirement community brochure. I mean the Scottsdale that exists just behind that image, the one where people come to construct the final version of themselves, where they buy the right house in the right gated community and decide, with some finality, who they are going to be for the remainder of their lives. My parents, Gerald and Barbara Whitmore, had been constructing that version of themselves for 11 years by the time of the dinner. They'd moved from Cleveland when my father retired from 30 years in commercial real estate, chosen a community called Desert Sage Estates, which features neither sage nor, notably, deserts in any dramatic sense. Mostly just decorative gravel and very tall saguaros placed at aesthetically pleasing intervals, and settled into what I can only describe as a performance of contentment so committed it had, over time, become indistinguishable from the real thing. Their house smells like citrus candles and carpet cleaner, the kind of house where every throw pillow has been selected. The kitchen has one of those chalkboard walls where someone has written, in careful hand lettering, "Gather here," which my mother did herself, and which I have never once been able to look at without a complicated internal reaction I generally suppress by focusing on something else. My father collects golf memorabilia. My mother is on the board of the community's beautification committee. They go to the same restaurant every Friday, a place called Copper Terrace, that does a $34 salmon that my father has ordered, without variation, for 6 years. They are not bad people. That is the thing I need you to hold on to, right at the start, because this story is going to tempt you to cast them as villains, and they are not villains. They are people who loved their children in the specific vocabulary they had available, and that vocabulary, in my case, turned out to be somewhat limited. Derek, 3 years older, 6 inches taller, and blessed with the particular brand of effortless charm that gets boys voted, class president, and men promoted ahead of their competence, was always the sentence they knew how to finish. I was always the one they left trailing off. He's in commercial real estate now, following my father. Married Candace 8 years ago. 2 kids, a Labrador, a home 4 miles from Desert Sage that my parents helped with the down payment on. This is not bitterness. This is just the ledger, laid flat. I moved to Phoenix at 22 for law school, stayed for a career, and built a life in the particular style of people who have learned not to expect rescue. Carefully, quietly, with good insurance, and a solid savings rate, and a cat who at least pretends to be glad when I come home. The fallibility I should confess to you now, before the dinner, before the document, before all of it. I waited too long. That is my flaw, the one that sits at the center of everything. I am extraordinarily good at recognizing a problem, and extraordinarily reluctant to act on it before I have perfect information. My therapist, yes, I have one. I am a fully functional adult, calls it analysis paralysis with a legal professional's justification layer. I call it being careful. She says we're both right. I had known for at least 4 years that my parents' estate was drifting in a direction I didn't understand. Small things. A comment my father made at Christmas about making sure Derek was taken care of. A question from my mother about whether I was really settled in Phoenix, delivered in the tone of someone who has decided you are not. The way they talked about Derek's kids as their legacy, and talked about me as their daughter. Beloved, yes, but the way you love a houseplant. Present, tolerated, not quite central to the vision. I didn't push. I should have pushed. Instead, I waited. Because I am an attorney, and I know better than most that you don't act until you understand the full document. The full document arrived in March. Let me tell you how estate documents actually work, since it's directly relevant, and since most people's understanding of wills comes primarily from British period dramas, which are beautiful, but not especially accurate. A will is not just a list of who gets what. It's a portrait. It reflects priorities, relationships, fears. I have read hundreds of them, and I can tell you that by page 3 of almost any estate document, I know more about the family dynamics than I would from a year of holiday dinners with them. I knew this. What I did not know, what I had managed in my careful professional way to strategically not know, was that my parents' will had been in the process of revision for the better part of a year before the dinner. And I did not know this because, despite being an estate attorney, with a 15-year career and a comprehensive understanding of the relevant legal landscape, I had never once asked to be involved in my own parents' estate planning. Because that would have been a conversation, and conversations require you to be present for the thing you might not want to hear. So instead, I drove to Scottsdale on a Tuesday in March, and I knocked on the door of a house that smelled like citrus candles and carpet cleaner, and I sat down at a table set with the good placemats, and I waited. Derek arrived 12 minutes late, which is standard. Candace was wearing a new top I hadn't seen before. My father had opened a Malbec without asking if anyone wanted white. My mother had made lamb chops and a quinoa salad, and a small bread basket that no one would touch, because we are a family of people who perform not wanting bread, and then eat the bread. The first 20 minutes were fine. How was the drive? Have you seen the new section they're building on the north side of the community? Derek's older kid, Theo, 5 years old and alarmingly confident, had recently announced he wanted to be a paleontologist. My mother said she thought that was wonderful. My father said there was no money in it. Classic Gerald. I ate. I listened. I noticed my mother kept glancing at my father in the particular way she does when they've agreed in advance that one of them is going to say something. Candace was explaining a renovation they were considering, extending the back patio, knocking out a wall, and my father had been nodding in the way he does when he has something else on his mind, and then he set down his wine glass, and he said it. Not gently, not unkindly either. This is important to understand. He said it the way you say something you've rehearsed enough times that it's stopped feeling like something that might hurt the other person. There's something your mother and I want to discuss. We've been doing some thinking about the estate, making some changes to make things simpler. We're cutting you out of the will, Miriam. Complete sentence. Present tense. The lamb chop I'd been cutting made a small sound against the plate. We're cutting you out of the will, Dad announced, and then looked at me with the expression of someone who has delivered a difficult truth and is now waiting for the difficult truth to be received with grace. My mother said, "It's not that we love you less." Derek looked at the bread basket. Candace looked at Derek. I set down my fork. Here is what I did not do. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not say any of the 14 things that occurred to me in the first 4 seconds, which ranged from legally precise to emotionally catastrophic. What I did was look at my father and then at my mother and say, "Can you tell me more about what you're thinking?" Attorney voice. Client intake voice. The voice I use when someone sits across from me and tells me something terrible about their family, and I need them to keep talking so I understand the whole picture before I respond. My father said they'd been working with an estate planner, that the current structure was complicated. I was in a different state, a different life, and they wanted things to go directly to Derek since he was local, since he had the kids, since it was simpler. He used the word simpler 4 times. I counted. My mother said they assumed I didn't need it, that I had my career. Derek still hadn't spoken. I said, "I understand. Thank you for telling me in person." My mother looked slightly confused, as if she'd expected a different reaction and wasn't sure whether the one she'd gotten was better or worse. We ate the rest of dinner. My father poured more wine. We talked about Theo's paleontology ambitions and whether the community was going to approve the new pickleball courts. I helped clear the table. I hugged my mother at the door. She held on for a moment longer than usual. I drove home to Phoenix on the I-10 with the radio off, the night sky large and very dark, and the absolute cellular certainty of something I had not told a single person at that table. 7 months ago, a colleague of mine named James Barfield had called me. James and I had gone to law school together. He now ran a small estate practice in Scottsdale, the kind that handled exactly the type of clients who lived in communities like Desert Sage Estates. He had called me in August, a professional courtesy call, a slightly awkward one. "I've got clients," he said. "Gerald and Barbara Whitmore. They mentioned their daughter is in estate law in Phoenix. I want to make sure you're comfortable with this before we proceed. Conflict of interest questions, professional ethics, all of that. I don't want to step on anything." I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I'd had no professional involvement in my parents' estate and didn't intend to. Then James said, "They've also asked for some help drafting some new language. I want to be straight with you. The changes are fairly significant in terms of the distribution structure. Your name is being removed as a primary beneficiary." Long pause on my end, the kind of pause I'd later bill, if it were a client call, as 15 minutes. "James," I said, "would they be open to using a drafting consultant? Someone to review the language and structure before you finalize?" He said he could ask. He called back 3 days later. My parents, it turned out, thought that sounded very professional and efficient. They did not ask who the consultant was. James, to his credit, disclosed that it was me. To them, in a letter they clearly did not read carefully, because my mother later told me she thought the consultant was someone from James's office. I drafted their estate documents, every page, every clause, the distribution schedule, the trust conditions, the letter of instruction. I drafted the document that cut me out of my parents' will. And if you think that's the strangest part of this story, please keep reading, because you are currently standing at the beginning of what I actually did, and you have not yet arrived at the part that kept me awake the night after that dinner in ways that had nothing to do with grief. Here is the question I need you to hold. Why would I draft it? What did I change? Sit with that. We'll get there. By the time James called me in August, I had been my parents' estate attorney in a technical, fictional, invisible sense for exactly the kind of moment that estate attorneys often navigate for clients. The moment when someone's wishes for their assets don't quite match what their assets are actually doing. Let me explain what I mean. My parents had money. Not extraordinary wealth, but comfortable, real, considered wealth. The kind that accumulates when you sell a house in Cleveland at the right moment, invest conservatively for 30 years, and live within your means in a retirement community that keeps the property values steady. The estate, by my estimate from the documents I reviewed, was structured around approximately $1.4 million in liquid assets, a house valued at around $680,000, and a small investment portfolio my father had been managing since the 90s. Standard, reasonable, exactly the kind of estate I handle every week. What was not standard, and what James had politely flagged in his initial notes to me, was that the existing estate structure, the one predating the revision, had a complicated system of conditional disbursements that my parents had apparently set up with a previous planner years ago and then largely forgotten about. Conditions tied to life events, marriage, children, geographic proximity. In other words, the existing will already had language in it that disadvantaged me. Not maliciously. My parents had set it up in their 40s, when both their children's futures were still uncertain, and they were trying to be fair in a forward-looking way. But the conditions had crystallized in Derek's favor over time, simply by the nature of how his life had unfolded versus mine. Marriage, children, proximity, 3 for 3. He'd hit all 3 targets without even trying, because he hadn't been trying. He'd just been living the life he wanted to live, which happened to align with the checkboxes my parents had quietly installed 20 years ago. I had missed all 3. Not because I hadn't wanted them, I'd wanted some of them, at various points, with varying degrees of honesty about what I actually wanted, but because my life had gone differently, in the specific and non-negotiable way that lives go differently, when you're the person who leaves, who builds your own thing, who doesn't call enough. The existing will, before the revision, already told this story. The revision my parents wanted simply made it more explicit. They asked me to finish what they'd already started. The drive back from Scottsdale takes about an hour in light traffic. That night I drove it in 53 minutes, which is the speed at which you drive when you are processing something, and your foot has its own ideas about urgency. Phoenix spreads out below the I-10 like a grid that someone laid down with absolute confidence and then lit up. And coming into it at night from the east, you get this moment where the whole city is just light, ordered, intentional, the kind of light that says we decided this is where we'd be, and here we are. I've always loved that view. It's the closest thing to peace I've found in a landscape that has no business being as beautiful as it sometimes is. I thought about my parents' faces at the table, my father's careful, prepared look, my mother's hand reaching briefly toward mine and then retreating. Derek's studied neutrality, which I noted then, and note again now, told me that he had known this was coming. Not necessarily that he'd engineered it. I want to be fair to Derek, who is not a bad person either, who simply exists in a family system that has always rewarded him for being exactly who he is. And that is not the same as being malicious. But he'd known. The way he'd looked at the breadbasket had the quality of a man looking at something safe. I thought about James Barfield's voice on the phone in August. Careful, professional. The slight discomfort of an attorney disclosing a thing that was awkward to disclose. I thought about what I had written in those documents. Every word of it. The redistribution schedule, the trust language, the specific clause that I had inserted, the one that James had reviewed and approved without comment. because it was legally standard and facially unremarkable. And because the thing about being an estate attorney is that you know exactly what language looks ordinary. I had one question I'd been asking since August, living in the back of my mind like a file I kept minimizing but couldn't close. Would they notice? That night, pulling into my parking garage, I had my answer. They had not noticed, which meant we could begin. Let me tell you about what I actually changed, because I think there's a version of this story that people expect. The dramatic version, the cinematic version, where the wronged child rewrites the will so that she gets everything and the favored son is left with nothing, and the parents realize what they've done, and there's a confrontation, and justice is served in some clean, satisfying way. That is not what I did. I am 41 years old and I am tired. I want you to understand that word precisely. Not bitter, not vengeful, not destroyed. Tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been trying to be legible to people who have always been more comfortable reading someone else, and who has finally, quietly, stopped trying to make herself easier to read. What I did was much smaller than revenge, and much more permanent. The first change was structural. My parents' revised will, as they'd requested, removed me from the primary beneficiary position entirely. That stayed. I didn't touch it. If they wanted me out of the primary distribution, then I was out of the primary distribution. That was their right. It was their estate. And I was not in the business of overriding people's fundamental wishes, not even when their fundamental wishes are concerning me. But there was a mechanism I added, one James had seen, reviewed, and flagged as standard protective language, which it was, technically. A clause stipulating that should the primary beneficiary predecease the estate holders, or become legally incapacitated, the estate would pass not to the primary beneficiary's spouse or children by default, which was what my parents' original language implied, but would instead be held in trust for distribution according to a secondary schedule. The secondary schedule, which I also wrote, distributed the estate 3 ways: 1/3 to Derek's family, 1/3 to a charitable foundation my parents had always talked about supporting but never formally established, and 1/3, quietly, cleanly, to me. Only in the event Derek couldn't take it. Only as a contingency. A last resort provision so buried in the document's back pages that you'd have to be reading carefully to notice it, and my parents were not reading carefully, and their estate planner had reviewed it as standard language because it was standard language. It was also the exact provision that would matter. Because here is what I knew that my parents did not know, and that James did not know, and that Derek did not know. 6 weeks before the dinner in March, Derek had been diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition. Early stages. Manageable, currently, but a condition that, under Arizona estate law, and depending on its progression, could in certain circumstances affect his legal standing to receive and manage a large estate without a designated trustee. I knew because Derek had told me. One phone call, 3 months before the dinner, delivered in the particular voice of a man who is scared and doesn't know how to say so to his family, so he calls the sibling he's never been close to because she is the one who understands documents. "Is there anything I should do?" he'd asked. "Legally, estate-wise. I don't want Candace to have to deal with a mess." I had given him advice. Good advice, the best I had. I had told him to see an estate attorney, not me, because I wasn't his attorney, and there were ethical lines involved, but someone qualified. I had told him to document his wishes clearly. I had given him 3 referrals. I had also gone home and opened James Barfield's draft of my parents' estate documents, which I was consulting on, and I had added 1 line to the secondary distribution schedule. 1 line. The breathing room here, I want to offer you, is this. I am sitting at my desk on a Wednesday morning in April, 5 weeks after the dinner, with footnote on the corner of the desk, systematically moving a pen toward the edge with one paw. And I am aware that what I did sits in a complicated moral space. I am aware that there is an argument to be made that I acted in bad faith, that I had information I hadn't fully disclosed, that even if every clause I drafted was legal, even if James reviewed and approved everything, even if my parents had signed documents they were entitled to sign, there is a version of this where I am not the clean party. I know that. I have sat with that knowledge for 7 months. My therapist and I have discussed it at some length. Her view, delivered with the careful precision of someone who has watched me process things for 6 years, was, "You made a choice that protected everyone, including the people who weren't thinking about themselves clearly. That's not the same as harm, but it's also not simple." She is right that it's not simple. Here's what I know for certain. I did not cut anyone out. I did not take anything that wasn't already going to exist as a contingency. I built a net. I spent 7 months building a net, in the quiet and the dark, for a family that announced over lamb chops that they were finished with me. And the net was not for me. The net was for Derek, for Candace, for Theo, who wants to be a paleontologist and about whom, despite everything, I have genuine feelings. If Derek's condition remains stable, if he manages his estate, lives his life, raises his kids, drives to Desert Sage on Sundays, the document I wrote functions exactly as my parents intended. He gets the estate. His family benefits. The charitable foundation gets established, which is the one piece I added that my parents would have agreed to enthusiastically if anyone had asked them, because they had mentioned it every Thanksgiving for a decade and simply never done the paperwork. If things go differently, if Derek's condition progresses, if legal incapacity becomes a reality, if the primary distribution becomes complicated, the document I wrote ensures that nothing falls through the cracks, that the estate is held, managed, distributed fairly, and that I am part of the structure rather than erased from it. I didn't change the will. I just made sure the will reflected the truth. There is a question I planted for you in Act 3, and I believe I owe you the answer. The question was, why would I draft it? Not as a technicality, not as an explanation of what I changed, but the real question, the one underneath. Why did I say yes when James called? Why did I agree to write the document that cut me out? Here is the answer, and it is the most honest thing I will say in this entire story. Because I had read enough wills to know what happens when no one competent is in the room. I have sat across from people whose parents wrote their own wills in longhand and left ambiguous language that destroyed sibling relationships for decades. I have seen estates evaporate in probate because documents were technically sound, but practically incomprehensible. I have seen the people who got everything and people who got nothing, and I have rarely seen the outcome bear a strong relationship to what the person who died actually intended. My parents intended to care for their son and his family. They intended, I believe, to care for me in the way they knew how, which was to trust that I was capable and didn't need them. A kindness that functions exactly like its opposite, but a kindness nonetheless. They intended to do something about that charitable foundation eventually. None of those intentions would have survived their original draft. The language was a mess. The conditions were contradictory. The distribution schedule had gaps large enough that probate court would have spent more of the estate on attorney's fees than my parents had ever spent on salmon at Copper Terrace. So I fixed it. I fixed their will. I made it say, clearly and legally and in language that would survive any challenge, what they actually meant. And then, in the margins of what they meant, I left myself a door. Not because I needed it desperately, not because I was owed it, but because I am a person who exists, and I deserved to not be entirely erased from the text of my own family's story. I fixed it because someone had to, and because I was tired enough to stop waiting for someone to think of me. 2 months after the dinner, Derek called. He called on a Sunday morning, which is not when Derek calls. Derek calls on weekday afternoons, brief check-ins, practical questions. A Sunday morning call from Derek meant something had shifted. I told Mom and Dad, he said, about the diagnosis. I said I was glad he had. He stopped. They're not handling it great. I said I imagined not. Miriam. Long pause. The kind of pause Derek doesn't usually allow himself. The thing you did. In August. Calling James. However that worked. I waited. I don't know exactly what you changed, but I know you were the consultant, and I know... Another pause. I know you didn't have to do that. I know things haven't been... He didn't finish the sentence. Derek is not, as I may have implied, a person who finishes the sentences he doesn't have words for. We have that in common, actually. It's one of the things I have always found quietly painful about us. We are more alike than our family's narrative has ever had room to acknowledge. I know, I said, which covered the sentence he hadn't finished and several others. Will you come out this weekend? Mom's making lamb chops again. I looked out my window at the Phoenix grid. Orderly. Lit. Decided. I'll come Saturday, I said. The last thing I'll tell you is this, and it is not a clean ending, so if you came here for clean endings, I apologize, though I did try to warn you early on about my profession. I drove to Scottsdale on a Saturday in May. The desert was doing the thing it does in May, where the heat is just beginning to establish its dominance, and the sky is the particular blue that exists nowhere else I've ever been. Not quite turquoise, not quite steel. Something in between that I have never successfully described to anyone who hasn't stood under it. My mother hugged me at the door. The house smelled like citrus candles and lamb and something else, underneath, that I can only call effort. The particular scent of people who are trying, even when trying is hard. My father shook my hand, which sounds formal but is actually the warmest thing Gerald Whitmore does, and looked at me for a moment longer than usual. He didn't say anything about the dinner in March. He didn't apologize. He doesn't have the vocabulary for it, and I have made my peace, slowly, imperfectly, with my therapist's assistance, with the fact that some people express accountability through action rather than language. He had asked Derek to invite me. That was the sentence. I accepted the sentence. Theo showed me a picture he'd drawn of a triceratops. We ate bread from the basket. The Malbec was good. The lamb chops were, as always, my mother's finest accomplishment. At one point, my father looked down the table and said, "It's good to have everyone here." He said it to the room. He meant it, I think, in the way people mean things they don't quite know how to direct. Broadly, imprecisely, toward whoever could catch it. I caught it. I am 41 years old. I am tired in the way that comes before something else. Not before rest, not before resolution, but before the specific quietness of a person who has stopped bracing for impact and started looking carefully at what's actually in front of them. I drafted a will. I built a net. I showed up on a Saturday in May with a bottle of wine and a tolerance for imperfection that I have been developing, unevenly, my entire adult life. The document is filed. The language is set. The truth is in the record, which is exactly where I put it. And footnote, for what it's worth, knocked a pen off my desk this morning, looked at me, and walked away, which I choose to interpret as endorsement. The door is not closed. I only made sure it wasn't locked from the inside. That will have to be enough. And on the best days, tilting toward a desert sky that nobody owns, I think it might actually be.